Hello, and welcome to the Ride a String podcast. I'm Kevin Sluter.
And I'm Matt Moreno.
And we are bringing you a show about orchestra teachers,
for orchestra teachers,
and those aspiring to be orchestra teachers.
There is perhaps no better known name in teaching stringed instruments and Suzuki. For many of us, we remember learning some of his method in college. We also know of the solo literature books, and possibly use them occasionally to supplement our teaching. But the knowledge and understanding often ends there. We recently sat down with Devan Bell, an orchestra director from Frisco, Texas, to not only talk about the Suzuki method, but also how she integrates many of the fundamental philosophies into teaching middle and high school string orchestra.
So when I was in 5th grade, my brother played the viola. I had listened long enough to know not to make that choice, and so I quickly decided that I wanted to play the cello. I was told I was too small, and so obviously I must play the cello. So I picked up the cello in 5th grade with my elementary school, and I played all the way through college. When I was a senior in high school, I discovered drum corps, and so I decided to join band as well. And so I picked up the euphonium and learned to play it, and then was in band through college. And so I did orchestra, and I had a BA in music, and then I graduated and kind of went on in life. I didn't pursue music after undergrad, but later on I decided that I wanted to make a bigger impact, and so music had always been a place of comfort and a place of sincerity for me, and I was able to express myself. So I went back to school, got my master's and my certification, and then became a teacher.
So I don't think I know this whole story. Before you rediscovered music, what were you doing?
I was a barista at Starbucks.
Really?
Really?
Nice.
Yeah, so I worked there from 2006 to 2014 until the age of 26.
Okay.
And so I made a difference every day by making a really amazing cup of coffee.
Y'all are important.
We are. I mean, if Starbucks went on strike, what would happen to people? Do you remember when gas prices went up? People were like, I'm trading my gas money for coffee, and then they blamed me. It's like, no. Life choices.
I bet you got a lot of good teaching skills through your people skills working there, I can imagine.
I do believe so. I learned a lot of grace, a lot of patience, a lot of brushing it off, you know, because you can't take much personally with the general population. You just have to do your best and hope that people reciprocate. A
lot of good parent skills, I can imagine.
Yeah. I mean, I also, was a manager, so I taught, and that was a component of my job, which helped to inspire me to be a teacher in music. So it definitely gave me a lot of experiences.
Yeah.
For sure.
And so meanwhile, how did you find that music was something you wanted to come right back to? Well,
music, playing cello, I continued even after my undergrad. I played for fun. When I moved to San Diego shortly after I graduated college, and I found a community orchestra and a cello choir, as well as a private lesson teacher. And I just kept playing, and while Starbucks was gratifying, as silly as it sounds, I did get to make a positive impact by just knowing people's names.
Oh, sure.
I wanted to have more. And, I knew that everything I'd always been a part of, I had always somehow been a mentor or a teacher in it. Mm-hmm. And cello and music was still something that brought me so much joy. And I wanted to be able to share that with other people. And I felt like I had the natural skills to be a teacher. And so it just kind of ended up being the path that I took. And I jumped head first. And here I am.
Here you are.
Here I am.
In Kevin's bedroom.
This is, for the record, everyone, this is the music room in the front of the house. Just for everyone listening, let's clarify that.
This house, did this count as a bedroom?
Yes, Matthew. It counted as a bedroom.
First names.
So here we are.
So here we are in a bedroom in the house that I share with my wife. All right.
We love you, Red.
So we're here talking to you today about Suzuki, among other things. I figured before we get into this, there's probably a lot of people that know Suzuki, as I did for quite a while at the beginning of my career, as being, oh yes, we have book 1, book 2, and book 3 in our library here at Durham Middle School, and these work great for solo and ensemble contest. What exactly is Suzuki?
So Suzuki is a curriculum and philosophy that was started by a Japanese violinist shortly after World War II. His name was Shinichi Suzuki. It was his intent to bring joy to the lives of children shortly after the war in Japan. And initially, the method evolved as a really significant component of the culture, but more importantly, the philosophy was derived in a couple of fundamental principles. One of the most important is that every child can and everybody can. So everybody can learn music, just like we can all learn language, which takes me to the second component of the philosophy. It's considered like the mother tongue philosophy, because when we learn language, we learn by listening, trying again, listening, trying again. We're constantly getting feedback from our environment, and in time we're able to speak. And so the philosophy is based a lot by rote, by learning by ear, and by learning by trying. And one of the other principles that I think is really important is that it really focuses on full immersion of music and a positive learning environment. Mm-hmm. So teaching and learning through love was just very important to Suzuki and has become something that drives me as a teacher. So the method itself evolved initially with, you can find on YouTube videos of hundreds of little tiny Asian violinists playing little tiny violins, and they are all playing at the same time, and they look the same, and they sound amazing. And over time it evolved into a methodology where they just took these pieces. Many of them are traditional repertoire. You have some of the great composers you have Brahms, you have Mozart, you have some Bach, you have a little bit of everything. And then it was evolved into the other instruments, viola, cello, and then finally later bass. And then it was brought to the United States, and from here has been evolved since. I'm not sure the exact date though.
So how is it usually structured, like class-wise, in a traditional like official capacity? It's generally structured as one-on-one lessons, but a lot of the lessons were observed by peers. So you would have one student learning where the other peers were observing the lesson and absorbing that information. In more recent years, it's used in one-on-one private lessons. It's used heavily in group lessons. Many Suzuki private lesson studios have group classes that they have as part of their studio and part of their culture. Because so much of the philosophy relies on the community, as well as like the parent, the teacher, and the student all having an equal role in the learning. The parent is the teacher, the student is the teacher, and the teacher is the teacher. And so now it's used outside of the classroom. It's used primarily as private lessons and then small group classes. In the music, like in schools, it's evolved over the past, I would say, decade. There is a component of it that's called Suzuki in the schools. And there's actually one here in HEB that is very well developed. Heard about that.
Right. Yeah. And so the way that they structure it, they actually have parents come for the lessons. They have group lessons. They put on recitals, and they structure it in that way. When I was working on my master's in Austin, I worked in a low SES school, and we used a format of Suzuki in the schools that we kind of designed that was more about empowering our students to have the skills, the vocabulary, and the steps to be successful with or without the parent support and without the private lessons. So still using some of the fundamentals, but to give them a little bit more ownership so that they didn't have to necessarily have that parental component if they didn't have it.
I know from conversations we've had, there's a lot of training involved with this. What does that training look like, and like what have you gone through with it? What all is involved with training for it?
So the very first training that everybody has to do is called Every Child Can. Every Child Can. And it's a prerequisite to book one of any of the instruments. And it's basically an introduction to the philosophy. I believe it's a 3-hour course, perhaps more. I can't remember, it's been a while. But it's a course where they introduce you to the philosophy. You read books and you just go through what the Suzuki principles are. After that, each instrument has book 1 through 10. There's 10 books that are sequentially organized to support learning different skills in an organized way and in a step-by-step way. So each book ranges from 15 to 30 hours of training. You can usually seek that training out at institutes during the summer. There's also colleges and universities that have started offering like full Suzuki certification programs. So they include, generally, depending on the book, the first book has 30 hours total. 15 of that is observation and 15 of that is class time. So you spend a lot of time observing master Suzuki teachers actually teaching lessons at institutes, and then the rest of the time is going through each of the pieces in the book and analyzing and breaking down into the smallest steps and the smallest learning goals and targets, as well as reviewing where did this knowledge come from and using the previous repertoire as a supplement to build towards future repertoire.
Is that so you said with each of the books, I can't remember if you said before, is it like, did you have to do cello book 1, mm-hmm. or is this something where it's all the instrument, or do you have to do each of those books separately?
Right.
Okay.
So you have to do each book separately. So far I've completed cello book 1 through 4. I've done a revisiting cello book 1. That was after I completed book 4. I went back and took a refresher class just to kind of iron out some conceptual things that I wanted clarity on. There's also a Suzuki in the Schools class that I've gone through. There are practicum classes where you can submit hours of your own teaching to master teachers, and then they can like give you feedback through there.
Cool.
There's a lot of different ways that you can do it, but the most common way is just taking each book one at a time, which you have to audition for. So every teacher has to be able to play piece in order to do the very first book. The selections are from the 4th book, and you have to record and submit an audition and be approved.
So do you plan to do any of the other instruments?
I do. I definitely do. I think as a high school teacher and an orchestra director, we spend so much time trying to transfer concepts to all of the instruments, mm-hmm. but there's still things. There are still things that don't quite transfer, and there's still things that as a cellist I can't quite experience as a violinist. Mm-hmm. And until I do, I won't be satisfied with my ability to model or really articulate those things. So I definitely do. I haven't decided if I'm going to go through all 10 of the cello books for what I'm doing and what my purposes are. But I could do simultaneous books if I needed to. But I definitely want to at least do a couple of the upper strings just to get a well-balanced approach.
So you've obviously spent a lot of time and money on this. What about it, keeps you in it, or what drew you in the first place? Like, what is it that you feel so strongly about with it?
So one of the things I really like about it is that the way that it organizes the steps and the sequence of teaching for the most part, all of the books are pretty well developed. If you look at the violin books, for every single piece, there are really well thought out warm-ups. There's really good tonalization exercises that work for everything. As you move down the instruments, there's a little bit less development. The bass method is probably the least developed, especially with some of the other methods that are out there for bass. But I really appreciate the organizational way that it introduces different skills, and also you can go back in the books and you can use previous repertoire to polish and to refine more advanced skills on simpler music, rather than having to learn new challenging skills also with new challenging music. So that's one component of it. For me, another component of what just is so important and what keeps me coming back is just the philosophy of every child can, and the creativity that it encourages out of me as a teacher to find exactly how I can make an environment to where every child can, whether it's the culture of love and harnessing our mistakes and accepting them and learning from them, and using that as a way to grow rather than the alternative. The philosophy of just immersing ourselves in music, I really love that. And then just like with our own playing, we have preferred teachers within the Suzuki community. After you take a couple of books, you generally find a trainer that you really connect with, just like you find a private teacher or a mentor. And so for me, I do have somebody that she's my person, and I know that I can reach out to her anytime. And so I have a mentor teacher that I go to every year for my training now. So I think the community, the culture, and the philosophy of just success and love and music is fun and wonderful. And also the curriculum itself is just very well thought out, and it works for the way that I think about music.
So do you find that a lot of teachers in our area are implementing Suzuki? Just in conversation?
I think a lot of teachers in our area implement it without knowing they're implementing it.
Sure.
I think there's a lot, just like all of us teach with kind of a melting pot of knowledge. I think that many teachers have experienced teaching private lessons, and they've used the Suzuki books without knowing the method necessarily, but they're still picking up some of the step-by-step sequences and stuff. So yeah, I do think a lot of people do. As far as do they know they're doing it and intentionally doing it, I would say no.
Right.
I don't know really anyone who declares that I am a Suzuki teacher.
Yeah.
Especially in a public school.
So for the teachers who don't think they're using any Suzuki methods, do you think there are any misconceptions about the Suzuki method and the approach that might get misconstrued?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think two common misconceptions are, number one, that Suzuki students don't learn to read or they don't read well. And number two, that Suzuki is only for beginners and only for little young children. And so the first misconception, the reading, that's up to the teacher. If you're not teaching reading side by side, if you're not teaching notation and rhythm and just the principles of theory at the same time, then of course they're not going to. But at the same time, why should having to use another sensory input get in the way of them being successful making beautiful sounds early on? So, that's on the teacher, in my opinion, not on the method, because musical literacy is connected to the instrument, but not until literacy has been achieved. You have to be literate before you can react to what you see on the page. You have to understand it first. Trying to understand, react, and make beautiful sounds physically, that is asking too much. So I'm sure there are plenty of opinions on that, but I do believe that that's on the teacher to make sure that their student is still doing the musical literacy side by side. As far as it being for beginners, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really great things that help to set up and build a common language a common approach to problem solving for students, as well as just some of the tendencies that you see. Some Suzuki students play with just a very like thick tone. They play with like a really like just sticky bow, some of them. And so that is a kind of a trademark. But so is having like a very precise, beautiful left hand. That's also a trademark of Suzuki teaching. So to continue on that, it is great for beginners, but the concept of using previous experiences to learn new things, that is everlasting. And that works for middle schoolers, that works for 4-year-olds, that works for high schoolers, that works for us as players. So yes, there are those opinions, but I don't think that they are enough to keep it from being a valid method.
So we didn't talk about this earlier. Part of the way we know each other is right when you finished your master's. Tenacious is probably an understatement about once we heard about you from another colleague, and we were trying to get you to come to our school over at Louisville High School. So you worked there as a split assistant between Louisville High School and Huffines Middle School, and so I got the pleasure to work with you for a couple of years before you moved on to Frisco, where you're at now. So I got to see this kind of firsthand. You very clearly work hard to find ways to integrate the traditional Suzuki method into the traditional string orchestra classroom, which is probably not the easiest task always, but it seems to drive a lot of what you do. What are some of the ways that you do that? What are some of the benefits of bringing that into the public school classroom?
So I'll start with my experience as a middle school director, because I think it's different in the way that I've integrated it. As a middle school director, some of the things that I introduced into our program at Huffines were things like having foot charts and rock stop straps for our cellists. So, violinists and violists, they have shoulder rests and chin rests. Their setup is the same every single time they put their instrument on. Now, whether they choose to hold it right, that's on them. Whereas so many times our beginner cellists are forced to kind of guess where their end pin goes and guess how long it is, and that just isn't consistent, and they're not prepared. And how many of us have said, flat feet, put your feet down. No, in front of your leg. No, put your feet down here. Well, let's just give them a picture for it. So we drew foot charts for them, which included the front legs of their chair, the strap of their rock stop strap, which we measured for them, and we sewed 1-inch lines into each strap so that they were able to know exactly how long they needed, even as they grew, because that's what they do. And then every day they set themselves up, and it's the exact same setup. Yeah, you could argue that if you have carpet, you don't need it, but we all know that rock stop slip on carpet and end pin slip on carpet. And, to build onto that, so much of what we do as lower string players and upper string requires balance. And if our instrument isn't balanced against our body, if we're holding it, we're not going to be able to have the same power and the same approach to the instrument if it's not just balanced with us, if we're having to hold on to it in any way. So foot charts and rock stop straps were a really big component for my beginner cellists. Another thing that we did was we created what we called mastery checklists. And we really coached them on the difference between learning and polishing certain things so that they could have their own ownership in knowing whether they were doing something right or wrong. So these mastery checklists have language that we built with them. We established a common language that we were able to use through their 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. Things like having a conversational head. As violinists and violists, a lot of times we see them tip over or tip forward and their head looks weird. If they take away the instrument, then they're going to look strange if they continue to carry on a conversation. Same thing with cellists and bassists. If the scroll is getting in the way of their head, they're going to have physical problems later. They're going to suffer in pain. They're going to have tension. That's not going to give them the freedom to move in the way they need. So we establish that we talk about pulling into our body with our lower strings so that they're pulling forward and using their back muscle, or pulling into them and using their back muscles as a source of power rather than just their hands. We gave them these checklists that gave them observable goals that they could observe in themselves and in each other, and they were able to use that language to develop. And it was consistent no matter where they were as a player. Whether they were a beginner or a senior in high school, the concept was the same.
So what were some of those observable goals that made their way in on a beginner checklist that even your juniors and seniors would be looking at?
So head above their spine, feet are flat on the ground, their weight is forward. Conversational head was a big one for us. Curved and relaxed, and that of course is always a hard concept. For bow holds, we talk about the thumb being like a doorbell. When you press on a door, the doorbell goes in and then it comes out, and so should our thumbs whenever they're flexible. We talked about naturally spaced fingers on the bow hold. The bow was made for the hand, not the other way around, and we were able to just kind of coach them on, here's your hand, all right, put the bow in it, and then set things from there. Umbrella fingers for finger preparation. We even had a Sluter thumb where we would teach our violins and violas how to place their thumb, because we had this...
We're talking about left hand.
This
right?
left hand.
Left hand.
We had this student named Sluter who just liked to talk so much, and so you wanted his eyes to be visible. We would draw little smiley faces on their thumb, and we would say we want their eyes to be visible but their mouth to be closed. And so then they would put the mouth on the neck of the instrument.
I knew about this, but I forgot. Thank you for reminding me. That
this was before they met Mr. Sluter of the high school.
And then they learned why. That I was the subject of their thumb.
And we just try to use words that they use in other parts of their life. Balanced, relaxed, strong, but not tight. So we developed those checklists to integrate into their just language. I think a huge part of that is establishing a language in any classroom, in any subject matter, them understanding what you're asking for and what your words mean, and then being able to articulate that themselves. I think it was a very important part of classroom success. As opposed to individual success, that made teaching it in a classroom easier because we had a very consistent language that everybody was a part of.
So what would, if any, what would be the challenges of implementing a Suzuki method into the classroom? Anything that you've come across that you haven't quite figured out how to...
Repetition. Enough correct repetitions. Some of the things we struggled with is, even though we provided those checklists to really help them be independent, it still requires teacher feedback to really solidify some of those things. And yes, we definitely used peer feedback, but even in a group class, if you're having to walk around and assess each individual student, students are still getting off task at some point when it's a class of 35 beginners. So I think that was something that we were still trying to iron out towards the end, was how to continue to control the quality by giving them our feedback, but still keeping them engaged when we had to take that time to do that, and have them actually use that time to do those correct repetitions. So correct repetitions and the quantity needed to solidify some of the physical techniques was a component that we struggled with. What else was hard?
Okay, chime in. I got to observe this a lot with the non-varsity group that you taught at LHS, and your classroom looked very, very different from my classroom, and some days I would just come in from going and doing so. I would go visit a middle school campus. I'd come in and it looked like chaos. But in reality, it was, you had them off on this task. I don't even, like, sometimes they would be in a small group, or you would have them paired up with somebody and they were on some kind of task. Trying to think some of the different things I saw you do. You did this, do you want to talk about the twinkle variations thing that you had? I mean, these were like sophomores, juniors, seniors in high school, and when you first said, hey, we're going to do this twinkle variation thing, my true gut instinct was, they are not going to go with this. But you know what? You do you, and you make and it ended up being this like incredibly successful competitive kind of thing. I don't know.
Right. So I love the Twinkle Challenge. It is one of the most fun things that I do every year with my students. So again, going back to using simple things to build more advanced techniques. The song Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. We all know it. We all love it. It's amazing. The first thing I did was I retaught it to them by rote, because I don't want the notation getting in the way of what the focus was. And the focus was the technique and the remediation, whether they knew it or not. All they knew was that they were having fun. So we took Twinkle Theme in D major for all of the instruments, and we learned it with just the quarter notes. And then after that, the first level was to add an open string crossing. So if you have D, D, A, B, B, A, you would add either an open A between the D string notes or an open D between the A string notes or the G string notes for the basses. So then you would have D, A, D, A, D, A, D, B, D, B, D, A, D, A, D. And so they were learning that variation, which on its own was fun and challenging, but what they didn't realize was that in order to get to a certain speed, which of course it's Twinkle, so they all have to win, they had to have a certain type of bow hold. They couldn't have a tight bow hold because string crossings have to have a loose bow hold at the end of the day. So quarter note equals 100 was a pretty strong threshold to force some of those things without them really realizing it. So level 1 was just a single string crossing. Level 2 was slurring that string crossing. Level 3 was adding string crossing triplets instead. So D, A, D, A, D, A, excuse me, D, A, D, D, A, D, A, D, A, A, D, A, B, D, B, B, D, B, A, D, A, A, D, A. So they're working on counterbowing. They're working on more advanced rhythms. They're working on triplets. They're working on string crossings. So then we just continue to add different ways to do it. Then we were able to do it in different keys. We were able to transpose by ear. We were able to add harmonics to everything. We were able to add shifting. So it started out as just something that was a competition to them, but ended up also being a way for me to quietly and silently remediate certain things I saw in their technique without having to say, curve your thumb, relax your fingers. So
they did it themselves.
They did it themselves because they wouldn't have been successful doing this fun thing unless it happened. And of course I coached them on, you need a relaxed bow hold to do this, but that's okay, just keep trying. And over time, they ended up with relaxed bow holds, and they ended up playing Twinkle very fast.
I just remember you going, who's the next challenger? And then you go, so, me.
That's really awesome. I need to come observe you sometime.
Thanks. Yeah, you're welcome anytime.
Yeah, I felt like when Devan came into the program, I just kind of like went, it's like, okay, this is at the time it was year 10 for me, year 10 and 11. And I just was like, all right, let's bring in this first year teacher, and, not in a like, I know everything way, but just in a, you anticipate, okay, let's help this person figure out how things work and all this kind of stuff. And then I quickly realized, I was like, okay, so I'm going to help with administrative things. This is how a program is run. But I'm going to just sit back and observe and learn a whole lot, pedagogically from you on things. So it was, it was a good learning experience for me. So Suzuki's obviously a big one. Are there any other contributing factors to your approach of teaching, any other big methods that stick out for you? Or
I mean, there have not been any other methods that I've really spent money, time, and energy training in, but I think all of us, I learn from my colleagues. You know, I ask what they do when they have a certain issue. I learn from observing. You know, I learn so many things from you and from Christy and currently from Priscilla. I learn from my students not being successful. I learn from my students being successful. But I would say my biggest contributor to my philosophy and my methodology is Suzuki, because it allows me to approach so many things: technique, musicality, fun, creativity. And, you know, there's components of Dalcroze, there's components of Kodai. We sing, we move, but, I mean, we all do those things. We all learn from our students, and we all learn tricks that we see other people doing, and we just kind of adopt those. So for me, Suzuki is just a really big toolkit. It's like one of those giant red ones that your dad had in his garage growing up that's just filled with junk. But it's all got a use.
Yeah.
Every single thing.
Well, you're pretty new at Centennial High School now. So one of the things that we've been doing with some of the guests on here is I guess we're calling it Ask an Orchestra Director. I'm sure it'll get an official name at some point, but that sounds like a good one to me. So I decided, you know, we've been sending out this Google survey to students and saying, what would you ask your orchestra director? And since you have a couple of years you spent with several of the students back in our feeder system, I sent it to them and got a few questions back specifically for you. One of the students asked, what is your biggest orchestra pet peeve? Feel free to go with like 3 or something if you can't narrow it down.
All right, we'll do one that's funny, one that's not funny, and one that's just kind of like inconsequential but still aggravating. So, a funny one to me, I think, and I don't know that every teacher finds it funny, but to me, it's really funny when students say, "This is easy." I find that to be very comical, mainly because I can always find a way to make it more challenging for them.
Because you're about to show them how it's not easy. Yeah.
Right, so I think that one is funny to me because it's just, it just is. It's like, oh, sweet child. Oh, sweet child. Okay, so an inconsequential pet peeve is gum. People having gum in orchestra.
In the middle of a concert.
In the middle of a concert. Or just in the room, in general.
When there's carpet.
When there's carpet.
And they're going to replace your carpet with tile.
Ew.
When it happens, yeah.
And then I would say one that is more serious is when students aren't willing to just try. Whether it's because they don't have a high sense of self-efficacy, whether it's because they're not feeling it, no matter what the reason, I really have a hard time when people don't attempt things, because then I don't have the opportunity to help them. I don't have the opportunity to help prove to them that they can be successful, and that is very hard for me as a teacher.
What are your pet peeves, Kevin?
Oh, mine. Man, this is easy one. I think in a similar vein, you give the students a piece of music and they look at it. They haven't played any of it yet, but they look at it and say, this is too easy. Or I played this song this difficult 2 years ago. And then, fast forward to 3 days later working on the piece. And they sound like trash playing it because they don't like, because they can't do it, and they think they can, and their opinion of themselves is so high. A more serious one, I feel like I just agree with most of the ones that you said. What about you, Matt? What are your biggest pet peeves?
Well, I feel like my pet peeves don't have the same type of gravitas as y'all's, but it too come to mind immediately, and it's kids picking their nose.
Ew.
And not realizing it. Yes, they're just sitting there, and I'm staring at them, and they just somehow go in their own little bubble, and they're just there picking, and I'm staring and waiting for them to realize that I'm watching them, and it's Yeah.
Oh, I don't think maybe that's just a you thing, because I don't think I've observed a nose picker.
Oh gosh,
because what if you get it on your instrument?
I can't stand it. And then if they're like, "Will you help me tune my instrument?" I can't stand it, and I don't know. Maybe I just notice it more than anybody else.
Will you help me tune my instrument?
There's that, and then like the one that I experience probably every day is kids who try plucking while I'm talking. It just like stops me in my tracks. Like just there's some form of ADD in me, and like I always get distracted and can't finish out a coherent thought. So
yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, that one I deal with that same thing, and I'll have students. Sometimes I've got a student right now. Well, let's just say a student came to me and said, you know, Mr. Sluter, you were trying to teach me something the other day, and you were teaching us all something new, and a bunch of the kids around me were plucking while you were trying to give the instruction, and I couldn't follow what you were saying. I could not keep my focus on it. And I was like, I am the same way. This will not be a problem anymore. And the very next day in class, I just said, raise your hand if when other people around you are making extra noise or there's a lot of sound, you just almost cannot learn at all. And about 8 or 9 kids raised their hand. And I said, these students are the reason that you are going to stop doing this. It's like, because they should have every opportunity to learn as well. And what was really funny is one of the kids that raised their hand, I'm not going to name the student, is one of the noisiest members of that class. But, you know, that's neither here nor there. I did think of one that probably is a more serious one that I think is going to cause them problems later in life, and that's why I think it's a serious one, is constantly getting students that know very clearly what the rule is. It's stated in writing. It's been said for weeks. It is common knowledge, and they want to be the exception to whatever that stated fact is. They come to me, I want to move up to a higher group in the middle of the year. I think I'm going to be good at it. And they'll ask me, and I'll say, well, no. Well, what if one of those students drops in the next group up? I was like, well, if we need a replacement, we'll go to your group and we'll have an open audition for it. And then it could go to anybody that places high enough. And I tell them that answer, and then 5 days later, a friend of theirs comes in and asks for them if so-and-so really wants to move up a group. I'm just like, or a deadline comes for a trip and somebody brings it 2 days later. Hey, can I still go on the trip? No, you can't. You cannot still go on the trip. Anyway, that's one of my bigger pet peeves, because I think it's going to haunt them through their life if they think that that's how the world works.
Sure.
I think this would be important, this question the student asked, partially just because I see this in a lot in non-cellist orchestra directors. What's the biggest mistake you see a new cellist make?
How new are we talking?
Like a student starting cello, their beginner year, something that is probably you would consider one of the biggest mistakes.
Probably, and again, to me, this is something that will haunt them, is the approach to their left-hand thumb, so their instrument thumb. As a cello teacher, from the beginning, I actually teach to where they don't have their thumb in contact. I teach them to pull into the string with tall, strong fingers, and they listen for a ring instead of a thud. And when they can achieve that on all 4 fingers, including the pinky, by rebalancing the elbow, then we talk about the purpose of the thumb, which is balance and which is stability. So I think thumb approach is probably the biggest thing that can hold them back and keep them from having fluid vibrato, keep them from having a healthy left hand, keep them from shifting smoothly, create tension, so many things. I think the thumb is probably the biggest thing.
That was the exact thing I was thinking. For middle school, it's just so many kids are squeezing. Yeah, and it creates tension, and they can't do anything. They can't shift, they can't add vibrato, everything you just said. But that's the biggest thing that I feel kids miss in 6th grade, or just isn't reiterated enough when they're starting out. And so I was always doing exercises with them, removing their thumb and like, explaining you would never play like this. But, just like having them play like a bunch of F naturals, just a bunch of quarter notes repeatedly, meanwhile tapping the thumb repeatedly just to show that it's not squeezing back. And they understand that it comes from the top of the hand onto the string versus the thumb assisting with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just squeezing your thumb, if you just squeeze your thumb, that carries all the way into your shoulder. Just squeezing that thumb joint goes all the way up your arm. You lose everything. You lose all of your relaxation and mobility just from one joint in our hand. So I think that's the biggest miss in beginning cellists by far.
Well, yeah, I've been working on the some of the state etude things with a bass player, and we don't really get to play as often as we'd like, I think, as directors. And so I think sometimes that almost makes it better, because when we sit down to play, we're a little more aware sometimes of the physical things that happen on the instrument, because it's not just fully ingrained as well as it might have been in our heightened times of practicing. And so one of the things I realized is, like, I'm playing this tense just as much as my student, and so I was working with them on, okay, let's see if we can play this. It's a little Night on Bald Mountain passage they have to do, and it requires this little shift pivot thing, and just kept getting tense. I was like, I'm going to play this without my thumb, and it took a lot of work to get there. And then when I got done and I just barely set that thumb back on the back of the neck, it's just like butter. Like, it was the easiest thing to play. So I do think that thumb is probably one of the biggest things for bass as well. One of the students asked, what advice would you have for someone wanting to follow in your footsteps? Which is actually a really sweet question to come from a kid. But
well, my footsteps kind of took a detour to get where I am. So if that's what you need, then follow it. If you're talking about following my footsteps and being an orchestra director and get to play music every day and have relationships with really awesome people, then yeah. I mean, it's kind of the best life I could imagine. So do it. I love it. It's great. And we need more. We need more people who are inspired and love other people and love music.
That we do. All right, so the next question from a student. If you weren't an orchestra director, what would you want to be?
That's really hard, because
you can't imagine doing anything
else? I can't imagine doing anything else at this
point. That's a good answer.
I gotta say, I couldn't answer that question.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I would be a performer, but being a teacher is all of that and more. So I
feel like that kind of says everything. The fact that you're just like dumbfounded at trying to answer that question is like,
I can't imagine being something else now.
You could open up like a cat refuge.
Oh my god, yes. I could be a music therapist for animals. Yes.
Or you could be the music therapist that provides animals in the room.
Yes, I could be that. That's a great idea. When I retire, actually no. If I weren't in the music classroom, I would go into legislation to impact education and music education from a higher point. But that could be my future, just not right now. Yeah.
What's the best part of being an orchestra director? That's the last one we got.
I mean, I already said it.
You said it all.
I get to my job every day. I wake up and I go to, quote, work. And I get to hang out with cool, weird kids and other cool adults. And I get to talk about music and I get to make music. And that's what I get to do every day. It's not even a job, it's a life. And so that's what it is. It's amazing. And I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Well, I think that's probably about all we have. Do you have any parting advice, either for anybody who's just starting out in the profession or somebody that's interested in doing some of the Suzuki things you mentioned, or pursuing maybe some of the classes and things that you've done?
I would definitely recommend pursuing anything that makes you a better teacher, and pursuing anything that gives you more tools. If it's not in the finances, then auditing classes is always a thing. You're able to audit as well as enroll for different prices. But I think just be reflective and think about what you do every day. Think about what works. Think about what doesn't. And think about ways to make it better for each situation that you come across. I think Suzuki is an incredible tool and it's an incredible resource and community. But there's so many incredibly successful teachers out there that have no experience in Suzuki. So I don't think it's an end-all, but I do think it is a way, and it is a good place to start. It's where I started as a teacher, and it got me where I am now. So I definitely will continue to let it be a part of who I am and how I teach. And I hope others do the same.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Devan Bell. The featured educational work at the end of today's episode is Sandra Dachau's arrangement of the Overture to Orpheus in the Underworld by Offenbach. As it turns out, Sandra Dachau always recommends this one to orchestra directors who have a lot of students with Suzuki background. You can find it at luxmusic.com. If you have any questions or suggestions for the show, shoot us an email at rightofstring@gmail.com.
Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts and join us for our next episode.
See you next time. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.